Okay, Zoom is gradually allowing everybody in, Eugenio, so I'd say we can kick off.
Thank you. Welcome everybody to this last session of the academic year of the series of the future of the island of Ireland. I'm Eugenio Biagini, and one of the organizers of this series, and it's a great pleasure to welcome this evening Ian Marshall and Richard Burke, who together will discuss one particular dimension, a very specific perspective on the future of the island of Ireland. And let me introduce also Barry, who will be chairing and conducting the meeting. It is a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and good evening indeed to everybody in Europe, and good afternoon to friends joining in North America. I hope you're all well. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm a research fellow in politics at St Edmunds College at the University of Cambridge. And along with Professor Biagini, we're the co-conveners of this Cambridge seminar series on the future of the island of Ireland. The series is hosted by the Cambridge Centre for Geopolitics and Sydney Sussex College. We're delighted that you can join us. I have the privilege of seeing everyone who's here, so welcome back to those who've been with us before, and a very warm welcome to those who are joining for the first time. The series is going to continue for at least the coming year, and I'll share details of our webpage in the chat box in a few moments, where you'll find details of forthcoming events in the series and recordings of past ones in case you missed any. On our webpage, you're also invited to sign up to our mailing list, either the Centre's general one, where you'll hear about the really fantastic smorgasbord of events that are organized throughout the year, including this series, or alternatively, you can just email me directly if you want to hear only about this series. I'll share my email in the chat box in a moment as well. So before introducing our speakers and handing you over to Ian and Richard, I want to briefly mention a few items of housekeeping, as is customary. As always, we want to finish in an hour. So in a moment, Ian will intervene for up to 10 minutes, perhaps less. This will be followed by a discussion until 1/2 the hour with Professor Burke, which should allow about 25 minutes for questions and answers. I'll give you 2 minutes notice when I'll ask you to wrap up, speakers. The chat function's enabled, so please use it to submit your questions for the speaker. I'll be looking at it for about the next 30 minutes, and I'll try to get through as many questions as possible with Ian during the time that we have. As always, I ask you to keep your questions as short and to the point as you can manage, and please state your affiliation if you have one and if you think that it's relevant. Finally, if you have any feedback, comments, or suggestions regarding the series, please get in touch. We love hearing them. So our speaker tonight is Ian Marshall. Ian is a former president of the Ulster Farmers Union and has worked extensively between Belfast, London, and Brussels, representing UK farming interests in the European Union. Indeed, when we invited Ian to speak, we could scarcely have known that agri-politics, chilled meats, and biosanitary arrangement for livestock and pets would come to have such a prominent place in the politics and public discourse of these islands. So we're very fortunate that you'll be able to share this experience and expertise with us. Ian was elected as an independent member of Shannon Éireann in 2018, making history as the first Ulster Unionist elected to the upper chamber of the Irish Parliament in a century. Ian served on the Shannon's Special Select Committee on the withdrawal of the UK from the EU, the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Change and Environment, and the Joint Committee for Rural and Community Development. In addition, Ian has over 35 years experience across the agri-food industry and currently manages the family farm in Armagh in partnership with his son. Richard Burke, Ian will be in conversation with Richard Burke, Professor of the History of Political Thought and Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, a position he was elected to in 2018. Richard's research interests focus on the history of political thought, particularly on the ideas of the Enlightenment, ancient philosophy, and political theory in the 19th and 20th centuries. Richard has also written widely on Irish history, above all on the Troubles. Some of his key works on Ireland include Peace in Ireland, The War of Ideas with London, Random House, 2nd edition, 2012, and The Princeton History of Modern Ireland with Princeton University Press, which he co-edited with Ian McBride in 2016. Richard is currently working on the philosophy of history since Immanuel Kant and on the history of democracy. And perhaps most importantly, like myself, Richard took his first degree at University College Dublin. So Ian, thanks for being with us. You have 10 minutes, and I remind participants to share your questions in the chat box. Thanks.
Thanks, Barry. And just could I begin by saying it's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I've listened to your other sessions and I thought they were thoroughly enjoyable. So as you said, I have a wide and varied career working in agri-food and agri-politics and more latterly in the upper house of the Shannon. I suppose from someone from my background, born in 1968 in South Armagh, which unfortunately became famous all around the world for all the wrong reasons, during the Troubles. We grew up in a very much a divided society, a society where you mixed with your own people, you stayed with your own people. There was a serious amount of level of mistrust and misunderstanding. And if we roll the clock forward after my term in the farming unions and started working in Queen's in the university, in the institute, I was asked would I run for a Shannon by-election in 2018. Certainly was a surprise and a shock to me to be even considered for this position or to stand in this, because remember, our politics centred around Northern Ireland. Although my farm and where we live is only 80 miles from Dublin, I couldn't even tell you what the political structure was in Dublin. I had to Google where Leinster House was because I was 21 years old before I was in Dublin. But that wasn't unusual or unique because that was a consequence of the environment we all grew up in. It was interesting because when I stood for the Shannon election in 2018, I got really good cross-party support. But the interesting thing, I suppose, was that I was supported also by Sinn Féin, which was pretty unheard of up to this because, let's be honest, I'm from a unionist, a Protestant unionist background, a farmer, a Presbyterian from South Armagh. So this was something that probably challenged a bit of the convention. I served in the Shannon between 2018 and 2020. As you rightly pointed out, I served in a number of committees. And they were really interesting times. And I suppose my initial thoughts about Shannon and about the Oireachtas, about the Irish government was that I'd always been told that this was a very cold house for unionists. And that was something I found not to be the case. The TDs and senators, the staff, the people that worked in there were warm and friendly and inclusive. And certainly I didn't feel any tension. And that's not to say you never felt like an outsider, because that's just a phenomenon of being, as they called me in Dublin, the Nordy. So that's a consequence of being from Northern Ireland. They were really interesting times and I learned a lot, but I think what my takeaway from the Shannon period was that the serious level of or lack of understanding that exists between Belfast and Dublin and Belfast. And it seems to be a bit unusual when we're geographically neighbours, we're so close to each other, we live, work and trade with each other, yet the level of understanding and misunderstanding is palpable. The perception of what a Northern Unionist was also surprising. And I do remember standing on the plinth of Leinster House after election and getting asked a question by an RTE reporter who wanted to know what my position was on the abortion referendum. And I said, well, I'm pro-choice, I always have been, always will be. To which my colleague turned around and said, what? Never heard the likes of it. A Northern Protestant Presbyterian who's pro-choice? Never thought it'd happen. So the perception of what Northern people were like, you know, it certainly was a surprise to me. And that lack of connectivity between Belfast and Dublin that I felt should be there. So in conclusion, when I was asked to do this seminar, the title of it wasn't difficult for me because I believe we have to move beyond the identity politics. And I believe that we've got to build bridges and unite people. I think that the conversation must be about understanding and respecting all cultures and all identities. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. Now, Richard, you've prepared a couple of questions and perhaps you want to ask Ian anything he's just said.
Yes, Ian. So, okay, well, you've argued that for everyone in Northern Ireland, the future will demand leadership to break from identity politics. And given your background and your experience, I'd like to begin by asking how you think unionist leaderships have failed their community with regard to this objective. I suppose it's arguable that unionism in Northern Ireland is in crisis. It's equally arguable that it's always been in crisis. I suppose my question is really, do you think this is down to its representatives?
Well, I think to answer that question, you first need to consider the context in which we look at Northern Ireland politics. Because Northern Ireland politics over the years has been built on fear and insecurity. Fear and insecurity of the other. And effectively, this mechanism of creating the bogeyman for whatever side the conversation was emanating. So I think we need to understand that based on the past, for many of our political leadership, it has been about survival. It's been about defending their position. And it's interesting because when I look at the history and I with all due respect to my learned friends who are much more knowledgeable in the history of Ireland, But I look at the history of the Republic of Ireland, which is about seeking and gaining independence, getting autonomy, to expand, to grow, to develop. And post-partition, Northern Ireland, the 6 counties, was very much about protecting and holding on to what we have. So I think that kind of sets the scene of why we ended up with this type of politics. I think it was very difficult for political unionism to break from the mold, to extend a hand of friendship, because remember, even though this seems like a long period of time, 100 years in our history is actually a relatively short period of time. And I think that political leaders during that period, if they were seen, and we could name at least half a dozen high prominent, high profile, very good unionist leaders who tried to extend a hand, and ultimately was their downfall. So I think I can understand. I think we're moving into a new era. I think this insecurities that existed before are there's many insecurities still there, but I think we're seeing leadership coming through now who are prepared to say, and this is where I have always been, to say that I have no insecurities with my unionism. I'm immensely proud of it, and for that reason, I'm happy to talk with or work with anyone.
Yes, I suppose I'm asking if you want to distinguish between a unionist constituency or constituencies and its leadership, and whether you think there's any culpability on the part of leaderships of stoking fear. So I totally take the fear point, but it comes from somewhere, and there are conspicuous figures who traded on that commodity. Not all, of course, but whether we're living with the legacy of a failure of leadership is essentially what I'm saying. So not a failure of the population, a failure of systematic consecutive failures of leaderships.
There is absolutely no question that fear and that insecurity was built upon and capitalized upon by political leaders in the past, and effectively don't vote me, you're gonna get them. And that culture certainly was prominent for many years through some of our darkest days. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to I think unionism has historically a strange relationship with the union, because it's born with the end of the union, ironically, insofar as the 1801 union means no other parliament in these islands. That's the meaning of unionism. 1920 creates a devolved administration. It federalizes the UK in at least one portion. So it's a departure from the purity of unionism in its original sense. So Northern Ireland unionism in that sense is anti-union. So, but of course we've come to understand the connection, the constitutional connection for reasons of security to Great Britain to now mean what the union stands for. But that again, you could argue, is a sort of negative self-definition. So I'd like to ask you, what is the positive unionist vision of the union? And I suppose, I've read you on this subject. I would say you tend to speak of attitudes, and that's entirely reasonable. But I'd like to ask about structures. What do you think the union concretely means and should mean, in the sense of what tangible institutions should best reflect that meaning?
Well, I think it's quite interesting, because when we look at the union and the structures of the union and actually the evolved responsibilities that we've seen emerge over the last few years, the one striking thing which I think I personally believe was fundamental to the success of the union as we move forward is that when I look to our executive installment, when I look to Holyrood and the devolved responsibility there, when I look to Cardiff and devolved responsibility, I'm a firm believer that there needs to be and should be an English Parliament for English people, because I think it's the one thing that's staring us, completely in the face, that actually that's one missing link in this, or one missing piece in this jigsaw. And I think that the institutions of the union have actually proved that there's no dilution or watering down of that union by devolving some of these powers. In fact, I would argue that the counter is the outcome of that it becomes a stronger union by devolving powers and responsibility. So I think I think there's a misconception sometimes that the union is static. It remains as it was always. It doesn't change. The strength of the union is that the union will continually change. And I've listened to many conversations about the end of the union and the demise of the union. And I would probably contend that when we look back to 1921, part of the reason why the agreement was signed, partition suited, a Belfast Parliament was acceptable, was because there was, in 1921, a distinct mistrust of political unionism of both London and Dublin. And you could argue and contend that that has always been the case, and maybe will always be the case. But I think that we need to accept that the institutions of the union, what that looks like, what the structures look like, will always change and emerge and grow organically. And I think that's a healthy, positive thing. So I don't think that some people that say that the change is a negative or the signaling of the end, I would disagree with that.
Well, I'll give you one example of institutions that don't seem to be treasured by unionist leaderships in Northern Ireland, because there are many institutions what one could point to as underpinning the union, the Westminster Parliament, East-West relations generally. But of course, North-South relations on the island are part of the union. That's to say, they're part of the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, and that's endorsed by the United Kingdom Parliament, and of course, electorates North and South. But a celebration of North-South relations is no part of the rhetoric of Northern Unionism. And I suppose my question is, do you think that's a mistake?
Yeah, I certainly do think it's a mistake. And I tell you where I place some of the blame for that, that when we look back to the Good Friday Agreement, for some, the Good Friday Agreement was simply about gaining peace and security and stability across not only Northern Ireland, but across the entire island and between two islands. So I think that's important to take note. But some sold the Good Friday Agreement as the precursor or the building blocks towards Irish unity. And for many in Northern Unionism, this concession to closer links with Dublin, or Dublin's autonomy or authority over Northern Ireland, presented them with a big challenge, and I say a big threat, to their identity. So I firmly believe that the North-South institutions in some quarters were rejected because they felt this was some sort of Trojan horse to Irish unity. I felt that political unionism should have grasped the Good Friday Agreement with both hands, because what I see in the Good Friday Agreement is a protection mechanism for unionism. And I think that actually they haven't embraced that or taken that on board, because I think if we stick to it, and remember, it's built on parity of esteem, mutual respect, it's built on consent principles. And if we stick rigidly to the terms and conditions within the Good Friday Agreement, Northern Unionists, Loyalists, Protestants, whatever badge or label you like to put on those groupings, are protected by that mechanism and by that agreement. So I think that I can understand exactly why there's a nervousness about engaging with Southern institutions. But remember, and I think the figure I last saw was we've got 147 institutions that currently operate on an all-island basis. So it's happening as we speak without any threat to anyone's constitutional position or to their identity.
Yes. Okay. Thanks very much. Well, since you mentioned it, I'd like to ask actually about the demise of the union. So when I interviewed Senator George Mitchell in 2002 about the Good Friday Agreement, he expressed his surprise that unionism accepted the principle of a change of sovereignty on the basis of a majority vote. In other words, that there was a mechanism built into the Good Friday Agreement for the demise of the union. And we know all the recent debates about demography, which is not a trivial consideration. So we may actually, from multiple angles, be looking at the demise of the union. But I actually want to ask you a question of principle. Do you think it's right that 51% of Northern, call them nationalists or Catholics, should be entitled to vote Northern Ireland Protestants into a new state?
I think that's how democracy works, and I may not like that on the issue around the constitution, but that is democracy. But what I would say is just we need a note of caution on this, because I keep asking the people who push and support this notion that we need to move faster on this, that the 51%, the 50+1 is fine. That's democratic. That's a majority. But what do we do with the 49% the day after we have that referendum? Because actually 50% or half of the population are aggrieved and feel that they've been cheated or they've been denied their rights or identities. So I think that we need to be careful, because we've learned from Brexit what a small margin, how divisive the small margin could be. I've actually no problem whatsoever with 51% if that's made in the full knowledge of all the implications and all the conditions that would look like, what that would look like. So let's consider what health would look like. Let's consider what education would look like. Let's look what the social welfare system would look like. Let's look what business, trade, travel would look like. And if you've got all that information and people can make an informed decision, then that's actually fine. My nervousness comes when you're asking people to make a binary question on a very, very, very complicated subject in the absence of information, because fundamentally that's the story of Brexit. And I think we need to learn from that and not become impatient. And I know sometimes there's a criticism at unionism that, well, you're just saying that because you don't want it, because you just want to kick this can down the road. And actually that's not the case, because I believe at the moment there's no majority for unity in a referendum. And I believe that based on a number of things, because we're always pointed and directed to polls and surveys and statistics when it's convenient for the author to point us in a certain direction. But I think we need to look at some of the things that seem to be a constant, and one of those polls that I regard as a constant, because it's going a long time, it's regular, it's conducted in the same fashion, is the Life and Times poll. And the Life and Times poll would indicate that actually the dynamic hasn't changed, the support for unity hasn't changed in the last number of years. So I think we need to be careful, because I see a problem we're encountering now with this whole conversation about a referendum, a border poll, about unity and many other things, which is fueled very often through mainstream press and social media. And I see that we're being fed a barrage of information and statistics all the time, much of which we can't validate or question its integrity. But more often we look at pieces of writing and work that are sold as being factual, but are actually opinion pieces. And I think we need to be really, really careful, because sometimes, and I look at the period we've just emerged from in the Trump era in North American politics, and I look at the influence that social media, that PR and marketing has had on the politics, and the populism that sometimes is driving our politics. So it's completely reasonable that if 51% of people want to change the constitutional position, then that's democracy. I'm a Democrat, I believe wholly in democracy, but we can't make those decisions in the absence of the complete and entirety of the information.
Yeah. Sure. Just to add a footnote to that, I mean, it's debatable whether it's democratic. I see that you're accepting that. I mean, you probably know Frank Miller, whom I discussed this a lot with in the late 1990s. I mean, to shift major constitutional positions in the United States, you require more than a 50+1% majority, and no state in the world has been constituted by a bare majority. So there's a lot to discuss there. But let's in any case leave it to one side. I'd like to ask you about the European Union, partly because you opposed Brexit vociferously and articulately. But you've thought of and you've written about the EU as a model for shared citizenship, and that perspective you share with John Hume, the former John Hume, the erstwhile John Hume. But I've got a question about that. Would you propose the EU as a model for governance? And if not, what is it a model of, apart from a general principle of mutual cosmopolitan respect? That's to say, so some people might argue that Europhilia is as tendentious and empty as Europhobia, and that a fully federalized Europe with an unaccountable executive is hardly a model for good governance. So I'd want to ask, in concrete terms, what does the EU model have to offer as a template for British-Irish relations as concentrated in Northern Ireland? So not as a value structure of we all like to coexist with toleration, peace, and mutual respect. That's taken as read. But as a model of governance, very few people would defend it as exemplifying democratic principles itself. So what exactly does it have to offer?
Well, I think when and you're exactly correct in my position on Brexit and my position to remain. And remember, that came about because when we look at the formation of the EC in 1957, brought together the collective of people to fundamentally stop another European war and to feed the European people. And for that matter, it's actually been quite a successful model. It has delivered on those objectives. It has brought this eclectic mix of nations and people together. What I always felt that the European Union had to offer for us, and especially coming from a small region that Northern Ireland is, only 1.8 million people, a region of the United Kingdom, was protection. It was representation, because actually we had a voice in there. And I understand completely that the governance model within Europe is very tedious, it's slow, it's unwieldy, it's very frustrating at times, but that, I believe, is a consequence of the size and scale of the structures. I believe that's a given. But it's quite interesting, because when I look at in the post-Brexit scenario, and I look at the UK, as much as I was a Remainer, we are where we are now in Brexit. That decision has been made, that horse has bolted. And what I now want to look at is what the opportunities are here, because what we now got in the UK is a degree of autonomy and flexibility to be dynamic, to move faster, to react quicker, to capitalize on opportunities. And I think that shouldn't be to the detriment of any East-West relationship with Ireland. I think it should actually benefit everyone. I think that we can lambast all we want about leaving Europe, but we're out. Let's move on. I think now we need to build those relationships back with Europe. It's fundamentally our biggest and most important market, especially in the area of business that I function in, which is in agri-food. So as someone described to me lately, the island of Ireland and Great Britain are not floating apart in the near future. Neither are the two islands floating off the continent of Europe. So those trading arrangements are still critically important. But and anyone would have to accept that Europe could do governance better. It's just an unwieldy model sometimes. And I think if we can learn from that and try and ensure that within the UK structures post-Brexit, we give autonomy to the regions and representation, proper representation to all those regions, then we can maybe circumvent some of the issues we had whilst we were members of Europe. But we can't turn our back on Europe, because fundamentally it's a critically important partner and trading partner for us.
Okay, because we're coming up to half, I'd like to ask just one final question, which is actually about the relationship between unionism and Sinn Féin. Well, do you think that Sinn Féin or any constituency within Sinn Féin has any interest in reaching what we might call an accommodation with unionism or unionisms, as opposed to simply ultimately defeating it?
It's interesting, because I think there's an acceptance and acknowledgement, and this was always brought home to me when I was in Leinster House. There was a running joke that they would never turn me into a Republican, and my retort to that was, well, I'll never turn you into a unionist. But what we need to accept, and what we all do recognise now, there is an accommodation mechanism happening in front of our eyes, because what everyone acknowledges is actually we can agree on a myriad of things that will benefit everyone. There's an agreement that actually, if we need for Northern Ireland to be successful, whether you're a unionist wanting to protect the state of the union, or whether you're a Republican pushing for and pursuing Irish unity, we all need Northern Ireland to be successful. So that's accepted and that's agreed. I think there's been a difficulty historically where political unionism has discounted or said that an agenda to unite Ireland was some sort of way despicable or bad or ill thought or whatever. I think there's a level of respect from unionism now to republicanism that, okay, that's a perfectly legitimate position to adopt. We don't agree with it, but we're prepared to work with that. And I think that needs to be, and I think it is being reciprocated from Sinn Féin and from political leaders in republicanism. I think that there's an acceptance that we are moving on. The passage of time heals some of the pain and some of the hurt. That if we go back to our earlier question about democracy, Sinn Féin, whether unionism likes it or doesn't, has a democratic mandate to be there. And look, it's a mandatory coalition in Stormont. And to be honest, for all the critics and all the naysayers about it, I think we've got a big five-party coalition in there, which deal with very difficult, very challenging situations, and there will be many bumps on this road. But let's consider where we are 23 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. Northern Ireland has changed fundamentally, phenomenally. I think when I look at as we travel around the country, the hardline Republican, hardline loyalist areas or softer, better places, because what people recognize is that whether you're a Republican or a loyalist, the thing you want is a job, opportunity, wealth creation, wealth generation, a house. And that's the shared objective, the shared aspirations that both communities have. So this green and orange divide has maybe been lessened if we look at the fact that there's a have-not divide, that there's a huge gulf or a huge chasm happening between the people, the big rump of society that are quite simply being left behind. And I think for that reason that we will see olive branches and hands of friendship extended both from unionism to republicanism and vice versa, because if we're going to build a future together, neither one side or the other are leaving this island, and we're going to have to do it together.
Okay, thanks. So back over to you, Barry.
Thanks so much, Richard and Ian. And just before I invite Eugenio, I think might have a question or two, I just want to commend you, Ian, because just going 12 rounds toe to toe with Professor Burke, you get your degree for less in Cambridge. So thanks very much both. I thought it was really a great discussion. So I've gathered up questions which I'm going to get to momentarily, but Professor Biagini, perhaps you have some questions to put to Ian.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Ian. It was a splendid conversation. Now, there is a change in the way Northern Irish people in Northern Ireland identify themselves, which goes beyond the binary distinction between unionist and nationalist. There is a growing proportion, a very significant one, recognizing themselves primarily as Northern Irish. Now I wonder whether this has something to say to tell us about the possible future of unionism. So is this proportion of the population asking for something different from identity politics, something which has to do with, as you said, jobs and opportunities and investments and whatever it is? If that is the case, is the future of unionism in the form of something like a regional nationalist party, if it makes any sense, something like the Bavarian Christian Social Union, which is not interested, of course, in separating Bavaria from the rest or unifying Bavaria with Austria. It is interested primarily in Bavarian issues and in defending, the autonomy of Bavarian institutions from the rest of Germany. Is this a future for unionism?
Certainly, I think unionism has recognised that they need to change. They need to change their representation. And it's interesting you mentioned Bavaria, because as part of the university work, we have partners in Bavaria. And it's quite interesting because on being introduced to these chaps, they introduced themselves as first and foremost Bavarian and secondary as Germans, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, that didn't lessen or undermine their credentials as German citizens, but they saw themselves first and foremost as Bavarians. When I look at the offering and how unionism presents itself, I look very often to my children. You get great inspiration from young people. And we look at children or young people who are in their early 20s, who very much don't see them through the lens of maybe the old unionist stereotype, and actually identify with a group of friends who aren't as interested in the politics or the religion of their peers and colleagues, who are more interested in the human attributes of whether they're good people. And it's interesting because when I spoke to my oldest daughter a couple of years ago at the last election about how she made her choices on parties, because remember, when we grew up, and as an 18-year-old, when I came to first vote, I asked my parents how I voted, and they said, well, you look for the unionist on the slip and you put your ticks in every unionist box. Because that's what it was, because remember, we weren't taught politics at school. So we had this right with this vote to exercise, but no knowledge of what on earth we were voting for. And when I spoke to my daughter a couple of years ago when she was 22 about how she voted, it's quite surprising because it's different. And I think sometimes we think that our values are the values of the next generation, and they're very often not. Because my daughter says, well, Dad, I look at who's on the slip. I look at, do I like them? Do I believe them? Do I think I could trust them? Do I think that they represent and help me? And it was really interesting because we'd never talked about this, but therein was the break from the old system of what colour was the party, what religion was the party, what was the politics, the binary of that party. And I think that has to be positive. I think as we get away, remember, we were all, everyone in the position of lawmaking and decision making at the moment were products of the Troubles and that difficult period in our history. I went to a Protestant grammar school. I was taught no Irish history whatsoever. I learned about English history, kings and queens of England, the War of the Roses, Tudor, Elizabethan England, all of that, but I never learnt my Irish history. And I've spoken to colleagues who were educated south of the border, who actually were told an equally narrow version of history and politics. So I think as we move on, as we become better informed, as the young people move away from that dark period of the Troubles, that their decision with politics, and it's interesting because I don't mean by this that you weaken or lessen your unionist or loyalist credentials, that you weaken or lessen your nationalist or Republican credentials, because I think it's very important that you have that identity, you're comfortable in that identity, and I don't think you need to dilute that or become this sort of benign group in the middle that don't subscribe to being a nationalist or unionist but just want to live in harmony, because I think that's actually quite a challenging position to be in. I think it's a much stronger place to be comfortable in your skin. And the paper I'd given you was about the Atticus Finch line that says, you know, to know and understand someone, you've got to get inside their skin and walk around in it. And I think we've all got to be comfortable in that skin, and we've all got to be proud of our identity. And I think that pride in your identity and comfort in your identity, whatever that identity looks like, is important. So unionism, political unionism, are recognizing that. And I think the leadership that we're seeing coming through now is very much saying, I'm me, you're you, but there's a common ground and a common thread we can share here.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eugenio. Okay, Ian, I've done my best as always to kind of group together a rather eclectic group of questions that have been emailed in or put into the chat box. So yeah, bear with. I've put them into 3 groups. The first one is a standalone on the European Union. Then I have a couple of questions that people have put in regarding the Good Friday Agreement and identity. And then there's kind of a very broad group about unionism and the island of Ireland and Northern Irish politics. So many of the themes have been touched upon in the discussion previously, so obviously only 10 to the bits you feel are relevant. So from Michael Darcy, I don't know if this was your Oireachtas colleague, Michael Darcy, but either way, welcome, Michael. Michael asks, following up on the question about the EU, what has the EU done for Northern Ireland from your time as chair of the UFU and involvement in agri-food sector? What is a good example of the practical benefits of that relationship?
Well, it's quite interesting because I think it's a bit, this is the elephant in the room. The EU has done so much for Northern Ireland agriculture, because what it did was well, and people are quite critical of the support mechanisms that agriculture receives, but those have been fundamental to survival of both agriculture and rural economies. We haven't seen whole-scale migration of our young people to towns and cities. They've been kept on the land. The rural communities have been kept vibrant by partly the subsidy and support that agriculture receives. And fundamentally, you have to realise that you either decide to support farmers and food production below cost of production, or you ask the consumer to pay more at the supermarket for their food. It's a simple choice as that. So Europe has been good at making sure that the rural fabric, the rural structures have been protected and maintained. As well as that, Europe are a real driving force in providing clean air, clean water, clean soil, animal welfare, human rights protection. So I think we could talk at length about all the benefits that you remember, Northern Ireland as a region have been beneficiaries of the support mechanisms coming from Europe. I appreciate and accept that the UK as a whole has been a contributor, but Northern Ireland, which we're talking about here, has been a net beneficiary of support from the European Union.
I'm not going to wade in too deeply because whilst I'm well versed on things EU, I'm not particularly expert when it comes to the union to the extent that the rest of the panelists are. But I just want to ask Ian, to put you on the spot, the very special status afforded to Northern Ireland under the Northern Irish Protocol and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU, is there any way that you can see that can in fact bolster the union? I often think about that it's only looked at in kind of the negative terms as a threat to the union, for the unionist community. Do you think it could be kind of spun in the opposite direction?
There's no question that this can be spun in the opposite direction. And I think, the protocol has been the hot potato of the last few months. And I think it is actually something that's badly handled. And I went back because there's a danger when you make commentary and take a position on a document unless you've read it and understood it. So I went back and I read it and I looked at it and I thought, well, yep, I can see glaring mistakes in this. I think that there was a focus on ensuring that there was no return of a land border across the island of Ireland. I think that the same sensitivities we're witnessing now with the Irish Sea border would have been manifested and would have played themselves out had there been a land border again. And I think sometimes we've missed this fact that if there are a group of people in Northern Ireland who, whether it's a perception or whether it's a reality, they feel challenged and threatened by the current protocol arrangements, well, then we need to take that seriously. Because if it's a perception that they're under threat, then we need to do things to address that and alleviate that feeling. The protocol is a part of this. We're going to have to deal with it, so it's not going away. The 4-year mechanism to vote on that is only Articles 5 to 10, and it won't take it away. It's there. So what your question was, do I think there could be an advantage in this? There's no question, of course there can be an advantage in this. And the interesting thing from a unionist perspective is that if Northern Ireland is a hugely successful, vibrant economy with foreign direct investment, with business, with infrastructure, with inward investment, well then why on earth would anyone want to change that and support a position of unity? And that's what I made the point earlier, that the interesting irony in all of this is that if you're a Republican, you want unity, you need Northern Ireland to be successful, because who on earth in the 26 counties would vote for Irish unity with a busted flush in the north? And it's not. It's a good place to live and work and be. It's a lovely place to live and bring up your family, and lots of successful businesses. And in the same vein, if you're a unionist and you want to protect the union, and London look across the Irish Sea and they see this dysfunctional society with problems and costs and disruption, well, certainly that's not conducive to maintaining and strengthening the union. So the protocol implemented and dealing with the sensitivities that people are laying out. And I think there's been a problem where very often the powers that be haven't actually listened to those concerns. They've dismissed those concerns. And I think had we looked at this earlier and started to listen to these people's concerns, that maybe would have mitigated some of the problems we're now staring at.
Okay, there was a short question came in by email that I was going to introduce later, but as you already jumped onto the protocol, I'll mention it now before moving on to the Good Friday Agreement. David Doyle asks, I never thought I'd read this out loud, but he said, is it really about sausages? Is it possible to amend the Northern Ireland protocol to make it work for those unionists who currently really object to it?
Well, it's quite interesting, because unfortunately the whole sausages story is a consequence of the society we live in now, looked at through the prism and lens of social media and media. And it's much more serious than sausages. And the interesting thing is that if we're going to make this truly work, remember we have businesses at the moment in Northern Ireland who are unaffected by the protocol. We have some businesses who have benefit at a consequence of the protocol, but there are chunks of society and businesses that feel and feel the real pain, the financial pain that the protocol has been damaging. So I think that we need to look at the mechanism we have at hand to see what we could do. There's been much talked about a veterinary arrangement that the UK would subscribe to, but I understand completely that from a London perspective, from a British perspective, that subscribing to those veterinary constraints or regulations would be problematic. That autonomy of Brexit is lost or in some way forfeited by virtue of not being able to be free to do trade deals and things. But what I think we need to consider in this is that if we all accept, and it's a bit like being an alcoholic. The first way you deal with alcoholism is accept that there's a problem. I think there's a lot of people out there still will not accept that there's an issue with the problem. I think some people have gone to the other extreme where they've said the protocol is horrendous, it is so damaging, we need to get rid of it. Neither of those two scenarios are accurate or true. So what we need to do is a compromise here. We need to make the protocol invisible. And what I mean by that is what you've got in the situation at the moment is you have effectively for many people in the PUL, the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, who see infrastructure being built not in the Irish Sea, as it's referred to as an Irish Sea border, but in Northern Ireland, at the ports, in the docks. They're saying concrete, hardware, they're saying people, human resources, they're saying customs checks. For anyone as part of the UK, that's break, that's interruption, that's disruption, that's separation. And that perception is extremely damaging. And I think when you look at this question, you need to recognize that there's a perception, which that's about, and the pragmatism, the practical issues that this is. So when I talk to my daughter in West Sussex, and the sausages story is a bit like the story about the pets and the dogs. My oldest daughter lives in West Sussex. She wanted to come home to visit my father, who's not been particularly well. And to bring her dog home to Northern Ireland to the farm was going to cost her £140. Well, that's just wrong, because she should just have been able to put the dog into the car and drive home, and that's it. So for her, that's a consequence of protocol and Brexit. I spoke to a chief executive in a local business who bought an office desk out of an English company, and they contacted him and said they couldn't export it to Northern Ireland because of Brexit. So he said, well, don't worry, I've got a sister company in Yorkshire, send it to there, and we'll get logistics to bring it over. So they did that. The logistics company subsequently contacted him and told him that the £600 office desk that he bought was going to cost £950 to export to Northern Ireland, plus £100 of customs charges. So that's the practical side of the protocol, the difficulties that it's presenting. And remember, many people who comment on the protocol don't actually understand it, but they base their decision on whether it's acceptable or unacceptable on the sound bites, on the paper clippings, on the social media feeds.
And I'm sure there's much more we could speak about it specifically, but there's an abundance of questions I'm gonna shift towards now. I'll just pause in case Richard or Eugenio want to say anything on this. Fantastic. There's a question from Sheila Watson on the Good Friday Agreement, and I'm going to ask this, and then a question from John Toland. So Sheila Watts said, how can politics in Northern Ireland move beyond identity when the Good Friday Agreement structurally embeds the notion of two opposed identities into the functioning of the devolved government? The one from John Toland is a little bit of a segue, actually, so I'll just pause there. So there's the question from Sheila Watts, and also from Sophia, a very short question. Is the Good Friday Agreement sustainable in your view?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting, because the Good Friday Agreement didn't create this divided society. This divided society was here, has been here for a considerable time. So the Good Friday Agreement was a mechanism to try and deal with and recognise the difference that we had, the unique set of circumstances that we had in Northern Ireland. And as I referenced earlier, I think probably a failure by political unionism at the time was that, and remember, if we cast our minds back to that, we'd gone through a horrendous period of violence. I'd grown up for all my life in a separated, segregated society, where you went to Protestant or Catholic schools, you went to Protestant or Catholic football clubs, sports clubs, gyms, you drank in a Protestant or Catholic pub. So we'd grown up in this. Here was an opportunity presented to deliver peace and stability and a brighter, better future for everyone. So I understand why some of the decisions were made at that stage by political unionism to deliver on this, because fundamentally the Good Friday Agreement delivered peace. But I think we've also got to recognise that political unionism at the time didn't completely buy into that, because it was, yeah, let's deal with this, let's move on. This is a mechanism to move us into the next phase. And I think that's important to note. So the mandatory coalition, it's quite interesting, because I look at the government in Dublin at the moment, and I've heard some people criticise the executive in Belfast and the mandatory coalition doesn't work and it's dysfunctional and all the critics. But when I look at the Dublin government, I look at a coalition, which is a mandatory coalition in the sense, because government could not be formed without those partners. So everyone wasn't jumping into the bear pit in Dublin to form this government because those parties all like each other. There's an acknowledgement, acceptance that they're in there because that was the only way government could be formed. So I would contend that you have a form of mandatory coalition there. And I think that actually, when we look at taking Northern Ireland forward, the province forward, once we deal with mutual respect and understanding, then there's nothing wrong with that. And I've pressed some of the people who are outside that structure. And when you press people on some of the harder decisions, they actually come back to the same positions that the elected leaders are taking anyway. So it's quite easy there's a saying in Dublin that talk about the hurlers hurling from the ditches. I think the saying goes, you probably know that. And you have a lot of people who are very critical of that. But actually, when you get into that and deal with the politics, how the executive functions, certainly we've lots to do. We've lots more we can do there. It could be improved, but we've got to accept that we've come a long way, and that, you know, we never would have some of the conversations 23 years ago that we're now having. So don't underestimate the value of both the Good Friday Agreement and the value of the Stormont Executive.
Okay. There was a question in from John Toland that certainly any Irish person who spent any time, as I have, in Oxford and Cambridge and in Westminster and these places can relate to this. So John asks, how do you make the present discussion relevant to the future, given the background of indifference and ignorance of the issues, which is to be found in today's Westminster government? So John pulls no punches there, but he's referring to there's any amount of examples you could point towards of just lack of awareness, to give a kind of a kinder sheen of what's happening in Northern Ireland from the Westminster government. Do you think there's any way of resolving that?
I actually see a lot of ignorance and indifference all over the place. You don't just have to go to London to witness that. I see it in Belfast, I see it in Dublin, I see it in London, I see it in Brussels. So I think the way you deal with it is break down those barriers. You educate, you communicate, you start to explain to people the situation. And I've watched this last week with great interest in Northern Ireland, because lots of commentary about bonfires and contentious parades and whatever, obviously at this time of the year especially. But a lot of the commentaries by people outside who have a lack of understanding of the subtleties, of the nuances of actually what's going on the ground. And I listened to an interview this morning with a pastor on Radio Ulster who'd said the extensive work that actually had gone on behind the scenes. And it's quite interesting, because again, media aren't interested in those stories. So I think if we look at this position where, and there's absolutely no question about it, that there's a lot of indifference and ignorance from London looking back over to Belfast. So we've got to educate and get those people to understand. We've got to communicate and work together. We've created a situation, interestingly, where we've created this tension between north, south, and I mean on the island of Ireland, versus east, west. And I think, you know, if we learn anything from COVID, what we had in COVID was a situation where we had 5 nation states effectively in competition. Who had less deaths, who had more deaths, who had more cases or less cases, more vaccinations or less vaccinations. That's not conducive to dealing with a global pandemic between 2 relatively small islands in close proximity. So if we can learn from that, there could be, and I believe there is a mechanism to, or an argument to say that if we created a triangle between Belfast, Dublin, and London, and if we included that triangle for talks like Cardiff and Edinburgh, that we could actually create a communication channel that would start to break down those misunderstandings and misgivings. Because I think that's what this is going to centre on, because there's a genuine lack of understanding of the other north, south, east and west. And I think that if we build on that, and we look at Ireland, how Ireland has moved in the last 30 years, it's multicultural, it's dynamic, it's growing. We look at Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is unrecognisable in the last 30 or 40 years, as is London, as is Edinburgh, Cardiff, wherever. So we're in this multicultural, secular society where actually it doesn't serve us any purpose to have one versus the other. So I think if we're going to be serious about building together between 2 islands, as 2 islands off a continent working together, we've got to look at trying to work together as a collective better and stop this tension of them versus us. And I referenced that in the paper about the tension about post independence, that this tension was created about the big brother scenario about Great Britain and Ireland, about that love-hate relationship like siblings, and the pushing of that. And I think that that's important, that we need to sit down and say, okay, because we haven't got that mechanism where Belfast, and you know, it was something that was first kicked off, an idea by Ian Greer, the Vice Chancellor in Queen's University, because he said he saw a necessity for this within academia to try and build an academic triangle between Belfast, London and Dublin.
There's loads of things I'd love to ask you about that actually, Ian, but I'm not going to. I forgot we were live there, but we'll have to pick up that conversation on, because I think that's super interesting about the collaboration between the capitals. But let's catch up on another point, because there is a question from Brendan Sims, who is the director of the Centre for Geopolitics and our sponsor. It's a historical question, unsurprisingly, and Brendan says, would it have been better for Ulster Unionists not to have been given a devolved parliament in the 1920s? I realise this is a big gear shift, Ian, sorry. So would it have been better for Ulster Unionists not to have been given a devolved parliament in the 1920s, which gave them scope to disgrace themselves? And should they have stuck to the pre-1920 settlement of direct and exclusive representation at Westminster instead?
That's interesting, because we're all wiser with the benefit of hindsight. But what we certainly don't know is what the fallout would have been of that. Because remember, these were really turbulent times on the island of Ireland. That's kind of making the assumption that if we hadn't moved to a partitioned island, that if we haven't given the Northern Unionists the Northern Ireland, that everything would have been all right. We could have been staring down the barrel of a 10 or 20-year bloodbath on the island. We just don't know. So I don't think it's all that helpful to try and look at that. Rather than look backwards, I'd rather look forward and say, well, we are where we are now, and the same kind of hand grenade has been delivered to us as regards Brexit, because it's created the same tensions between North, South, and East and West. And I would rather consider how we deal with these things to go forward, because look, there's so many things we could. The interesting thing, I suppose, that I've always seen with Irish history is that Irish history is fascinating because of the rich tapestry of stories that it is. But its value is in that it's a complete story. Because if you start to take out an item or an incident or an event at a point in time, it completely changes the dynamic and the history as it unfurls. So I think it's not probably helpful to think, because I could think of another at least half a dozen things that we could say, well, if this didn't happen, do you think? So let's take it as it is. Let's understand it better. Let's accept that that's what has made us who we are. And let's work forward to try and make this all a better place.
I think we have time for one very short one, right? A final one, and it's from John Dunn. And John, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to try and summarize your question. I think this is what it means. Ian, do you think, this is a little bit, this came out with your conversation with Richard a little bit. Do you think the leadership exists in the Unionist and in the Republican communities to make Northern Ireland a better place to live, or are things too entrenched?
I think the leadership does exist. I think when we look back, the big leaders of the past, and we can all think of the 1, 2, or 3 or more big leaders who made big decisions, and that was based on their security in their identity. I think potentially we have big leaders in our midst, but what they're going to need is be confident enough. And actually, it's quite interesting, because we've seen some glimmers of light in this, where some of our leadership are making calls now that maybe would have been unheard of 2 or 3 years ago. So I believe we have, but more than that, I believe we've people who have a vision and people who believe that we can do this better. And I think that's the important thing. So yeah, I believe those leaders are there. What they need is the comfort of, or the assurance from within their party structures and from the electorate, that if they make brave decisions, people stick by them. Because that's been part of the problem. And you know, I could name a number of leaders in unionism who have made fairly brave calls in the last 20 years, and it's cost them their political career. I think we need to move on from that. We need to support all those leaders on either side of the political divide that make gestures and not write them off as just gesturing. Take them for what they're done in the spirit that they're delivered, as meaningful examples of how each community can reach out to the other. So yeah, I think the leaders are there. We just need to nurture them, support them, and we share this aspiration to build a better Northern Ireland where everyone wants to live and work together. So yeah, I think they're there.
Thank you, Ian. Your answer did far better justice to the question from John Dunn than I could. So thank you so much. I think that's exactly what he was getting at, whether the leadership exists as it had done in the recent past. I'm going to wrap up, but just to invite, there's absolutely no compulsion, but if Richard or Eugenio want to say anything in response to any of Ian's remarks.
Well, I should just say I've been very impressed by what you said, but it seems to me the problem is whether people are prepared to work along the lines which you suggested, or whether the vested interests of existing parties and political leaders will continue to determine or try to determine the future in the way in which they block the past for as long as this was possible. So that is a question which goes beyond your arguments. It's not a question of what you argue, that is a question of personality, vested interest, and the way party politics works.
Yeah, and I think in response to that, I think it will change, because I think, and I firmly believe, the people are ahead of the politics. And what we're learning now is that it's a very, very dangerous path to tread if you don't listen to the people.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a perfect note on which to conclude, I think. Apologies to those questions that I didn't manage to get to, but as always, I will share them with Ian. So Ian, you'll have them just so you know what people are thinking about whilst they're listening to you. And the recording of this will be available next week. We will take a break for the summer, and our next scheduled meeting will be with David Lidington, former Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, when he's going to talk about relations between Dublin and London in conversation with our own Professor Eugenia Biagini on the 20th of September. This will be followed by Claire Hanna MP, the SDLP MP for South Belfast, in conversation with Nicholas Allen, all the way from the University of Georgia, on Monday, the 4th of October at 6 p.m. So it just falls to me to thank Ian very, very much, and indeed thank Richard very, very much for your time and for your thoughtfulness. I very much enjoyed the conversation and hope you can continue it again at some point in perhaps at a less virtual meeting. Ian. Thank you for your time, everybody. Have a good evening and rest of your summer.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.